I think one of the ways that we can achieve this as the people who lead or influence so much of the crisis response, or who should be leading or influencing it, is to make things more personal. And on that note, this book should be required reading for every communicator. It's immensely well written and it covers real stories of people who've endured public shaming and what it's done to their lives. And I thought about it. I picked it up off the shelf again a few months back when we were media training some very highly polished country managers from a multinational. These guys had clearly been media trained many, many times before, media trained pretty much to within an inch of their lives. And look, we couldn't even rouse an eyelid twitch, let alone a sweat. And in the end, we just stopped because it was pointless. They were just rattling off these nice, smooth, really polished answers. And we just weren't getting anywhere that they were really responding or reacting to. So we had to make it real somehow. And finally, I hit on it and said to them, hey, look, what keeps you guys up at night? What do you really, really fear the most at work? What do you worry about happening? What would just send you over the edge in terms of any kind of a publicity event? And it turned out that every single scenario they came up with was incredibly personal. It was sometime that they'd dropped the ball or they'd been involved in a decision or activity that reflected badly on them, not just their company. So we have to make it real and we have to make it personal when we're running crisis simulations or engaging leaders with the issues. Otherwise, it's just rote learning and they've got no skin in the game and we end up with these paint-by-numbers crisis responses. So sometimes the best approach for the leaders is to remind them of the one thing that communicators know best and that leaders tend to fear the most, and that's the court of public opinion. This whole issue of getting personal with things really hit home with me not long after the earthquakes happened. I was dashing up and down the country for work, and often I'd go into the Kolu Lounge and find just screeds of USAR workers, urban search and rescue workers, waiting for flights as well. And we'd sit and we'd chat, and actually it was wonderful when they were there because you knew if there was a big event, you were pretty much in the safest place in town. One of them was a really big burly firefighter from San Francisco, and I got talking to him about his experiences working on our earthquake. And what was really interesting is that he'd said it had really shaken him up, and we started talking about this, and he'd seen many, many, many of these sorts of scenarios, but he was used to seeing them in parts of the world where their houses didn't look like his houses. The families, the people did not look like his families. There were big cultural differences, and it really struck home how much that had personally impacted him and how shaken he had been by that. So we've really got to get out of this command and control mode of crisis management, and it's a balance, isn't it? It can be very essential in the very, very earliest hours and days of a major disaster. I kind of get that argument, but I kind of don't, because on the day we saw so many examples of people literally just jumping into the middle of the road to direct traffic, pull people out of buildings and put them on the back of pickup trucks and drive the wrong way down one-way streets to get them to the hospital, but they got them there. And that very, very early response was incredibly community driven. Everyone just did it. Once the EOC was set up, everyone was told to, hey, just go home and build your toilets and wait it out. And it was massively disempowering for the city, very, very distancing for people, and enormously alienating for the community who really felt like the city was being overtaken. And sitting and watching the effects of this, even over the months afterwards, was one of my greatest sadnesses as a communicator, especially one who was really passionate about the engagement approach to things, because we really had an us and them mentality that had built up between the people who lived in the city and the people who are now running the city. And as I said earlier, we'd been this massively strong, collaborative city, and in health, which was my strongest area of specialisation before the quakes, we had a sort of integration from a practical, philosophical and comm sense that was pretty much the envy of the rest of the country. We'd made immense strides from a crisis perspective as well. We'd done tons of work on pandemic planning to the point that we had local media sitting around our planning table. We didn't just call them in at the simulation stage when we were doing crisis responses and things. We didn't just wait for things to hit the fan. We had them involved in our planning so they could understand the dilemmas and the really big issues that this pandemic planning was going to bring, and the fact that there were no easy answers. And so when the city started to regroup itself after the quakes and everyone did go home and build their long drops and wait to see what happened next, our media would have expected to have been very much a part of that official response, but in fact they were locked out of the EOC, and it took probably 3 or 4 days to get a media centre set up, and it certainly wasn't something that was top of mind for the official response, and really did create again this us and them sort of a mentality. In the end, the community response did organise itself. They finished building their long drops and they went out there and got stuff done, and it emerged very much in its own way, and largely really by bypassing the emergency and recovery functions, the official side of things, because by then they were perceived as very bureaucratic, obstacle focused, too slow, too autocratic. And one of the most highly visible and effective community responses that came out of this period was the Student Volunteer Army. Now, this was a social media initiative that was created by a young man who could see there was a real need there out in the suburbs for things as simple as shoveling liquefaction. And if you've never lived in a quake zone, if you've never heard of liquefaction, it is the most revolting stuff you can imagine. It's pretty much when the ground liquefies and comes up through the road, through the pavements, through your back lawn, this disgusting sandy stuff like quicksand. And it was one of our troubles in Christchurch. We were built on very highly liquefiable soil, so everything was just so soft that the damage was incredible. So these students signed up to this Facebook page and went and shoveled liquefaction in the suburbs that it needed to happen in. And it just happened out to the side of the official response, and again, immensely powerful. And this tension and balance between central and localised control really doesn't seem to be an easy one to solve. But certainly cutting the community out together is not the way to do it. And we really need to start thinking about how we create roles for organised volunteerism in these scenarios. If we're not to disempower the community completely and create that massive us and them response. And this quote isn't mine. I bumped into a colleague, Lee Harris, fantastic, very, very talented communications professional, who also runs an agency in town, and I saw her of all places at the hairdresser, and I talked about going to New Orleans to give this crisis management presentation and how to tell the Christchurch story, and it's so big, even which aspects were we going to tell. And we talked about a whole lot of things, and she made this comment, and I just thought it was absolutely stunning. It was really true. And she said in New Orleans nobody came, and that was a tragedy, and in Christchurch everybody came, and that was a tragedy too. And it was so true. Neither approach was right. And when we say everybody came, we don't mean you, Sarah, and those amazing people who came and dragged people out of buildings and got involved in all that kind of stuff. But certainly there was a massive amount of external interference in our city, and that remains to today as well. And one of the great adjustments as a city that we've had to make is the loss of our own local power base. And at the start, when the struggle was still fresh, a lot of things still felt more possible than they actually do today. There were some fantastic ideas that emerged. They had a share an idea kind of a session where people were encouraged to add post-it notes of their ideas for how the new central city could be. But the reality is 5 years on, as the years have worn on, all of those big visions have become smaller. The planning is not ours. The planning belongs with the government, with government entities and agencies and centralised functions. And many things have actually been taken off the table altogether. And the sense of that really early engagement and enthusiasm has led to quite a sense of helplessness, defeatism and cynicism as well. And I think what's important here is it's a salient lesson in being careful of what you implicitly promise. Nobody really knew where the power base would lie. Now it's very, very clear it is not with our local city council. From a pragmatic planning perspective, we need to get real about life in disaster zones or in a disaster-prone country. We've got to stop writing these hermetically sealed crisis plans that don't even really scratch the surface as to the real-world conditions on the ground, and that are basically useless in the emergency response. And very, very many organisations in town found themselves with these crisis management plans on the day and after the quakes, where it's like, great, you met a KPI last year by creating or updating this crisis management plan. But how useful is it when you have no power, no water, no sewage, no electricity, and no way to find people? So part of the job in the business as usual stage before these disasters hit, especially for multi-city organisations, is to engage people with real world realities. And not just the ones who are on the ground in extreme weather, forest fire, quake zones, but others in their organisation in the wider global sense. And from the same media training session with the Slip corporate guys, they were telling us a story about how there'd been a massive cyclone in the country they manage, and head office was based somewhere far, far away, and it hadn't occurred to head office, who had fully functioning electricity, SMS, internet, email, cell phone networks, flushing toilets, just how impossible and slow it is to get things done under disaster conditions. And so as these people are just still trying to find their feet and figure out what's where and sort themselves out, head office was continually pestering this local office on day one for confirmation that all the staff were safe and accounted for. And look, it was something that was just impossible to give. They could not give them that reassurance, as it turned out, for a number of days. But you can spend a lot of time fighting with your organisation at a time when you really need the support as well. If you've got complex messaging to give out, don't wait till the plane is on the way down, metaphorically speaking. So airlines, I think, have a lot to offer us. I've been thinking about what's a different kind of model. How can we replace the current broken crisis management model with something that works better? And airlines do a fantastic job of melding these business as usual service messages with emergency messaging. And we can all take a leaf out of their book and get things into people's heads when they're calm and pull out just the very basics. Make it simple, make it straightforward, and basically rinse and repeat. So airlines know they're at risk of incidents, and if you live in a quake or a tsunami or a bushfire zone, we do too. And in Christchurch, right after the quakes, the city council put coloured placards up on buildings and on business workplaces indicating whether an office was deemed safe to enter or not. But there was massive confusion amongst business owners about what the placards actually meant, and many, including us, who got a green or safe to enter placard, thought that it meant an engineer had been through it and decided it was safe, but it didn't. It just meant the building had had a cursory check. And then not long afterwards, just to add to the confusion, the city's residential zones were divided up into areas of quake damagedness, using the same colours that they'd used in these coloured placards, but they had very, very different meanings. So if you're going to create a system like that, which seems like a no-brainer and it makes complete sense, roll it out when things are still good. Help people to understand while things are still calm and quiet and people can take things in, what this actually means. And especially, as I say, if you're living in a quake zone, you know this thing is coming. Same thing for the way that the scientists talk about risk. One of the very, very big things in Christchurch was this massive uncertainty from those who were both dealing with forecasting, predicting, and trying to understand the science around the quakes. An enormous amount of reticence to communicate too much to the public for fear that it would be too much for the public to handle, particularly in the space between the September quake and the February quake, the big one, where they knew that there were 4 locations that another big quake was likely to happen. Of course, it ended up being the central city, but there were 4 other locations that ended up on their radar that they were watching, but they didn't tell people about it. And their rationale was, well, people can't do anything, they wouldn't behave differently, we can't tell them about this. But certainly in time, they got a lot better at talking about it openly and telling people what they needed to know, things that could make a difference to their lives. And also came to the realization that actually we're grown-ups. We could actually handle having that information and having it on board. And as Professor Mark Quigley, who was a real superstar, he was a geologist who really rose to prominence because he just talked straight about the quakes and interpreted them out of scientific terms into lay terms and really helped us understand them. As Mark Quigley said, the quakes were a real sea change time for New Zealand in terms of how we talk about earthquakes, and it makes complete sense. There's still a nagging thing in the back of my mind, though, that goes, they call us the Shaky Isles. Why had we not thought of this before? Why were these debates about how to talk to the public, about how to let people know what's going on, why were they not going on before the big one hit? I think we can all take a lot of lessons from Japan which fully embraces its quakiness. And like Wellington and the South Island's Alpine Fault, Tokyo is way overdue for a really big quake. And they found a way to make it personal, relevant, and pragmatic. So they've created a 300-page manga book, a cartoon book called Tokyo X Day, and it is 300 pages about earthquake preparedness, published by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government. It includes tips on very basic pragmatic things like how to make fly traps to rid evacuation centres of pests, and starts with quite a weighty warning. Experts say there's a 70% chance of a very large quake directly hitting the Greater Tokyo area within the next 3 decades and home to 36 million people. So what if you're from out of town or unfamiliar with the local communications culture? And I really do feel sometimes for people who do have to come and work in Christchurch from Wellington or from other centres, particularly those who've had to work on the official response, because it must have felt very, very hard sometimes to break into us locally because of that whole us and them thing. Look, the single biggest piece of advice I can give you is do not make assumptions and listen before you talk. And don't think that your last visit is the way things are, that things will be this visit. The local mood can, and it still does, shift rapidly and inexplicably. And it can leave what you prepared yesterday completely irrelevant today. So just this February, coming up to the 5th anniversary, which felt like a real milestone, we were all starting to write annual reports again and remembrance posts, coming up to the 5th anniversary, that for the first time really put the quakes into the context of the past. It was something that had happened and that we were recovering from. But 3 days before that landmark anniversary on a Sunday, the city was hit by another very shallow, very close magnitude 5.7 quake. And it just threw everyone back into that response, reaction loop. And we were all thrown back probably a good year or so to the last very, very big one. So other advice at a more personal level, I drove around with a pair of gym shoes in the back of my car for, probably a good couple of years. Today, I still carry flat shoes in the carry-on under the seat in front of me when I fly. And we've all got our little quirks. I've got friends who still won't walk into movie theatres. My husband's not really big on underground car parks. I don't like anything that shakes or makes big banging noises. And look, everyone's got their own thing, but you can't prepare for that. You can't prepare for that very primitive response that happens to you when you've been through something like that. But you can think about how to make it easier on yourself and make it easier for you to do your job. And so one of the things I'd really recommend is you think about your own personal and professional disaster kit and what it is you and your family would do in the event of a major disaster, and talk about it. And so that everybody knows that actually if something like this happens, here's how we're going to get a hold of each other, here's how we're going to meet. And on a day-to-day level, we still let each other know where we are in shopping malls, and if someone's in an underground car park, text people, and it's just part of how we are these days. It's part of our psyche. And it sounds trite, but if you and your family aren't ready at a personal level, then there's absolutely no way you are ready for it professionally. And these events need great communications professionals. We absolutely need it. And many of the problems I think that happened in Christchurch were because the communications response was subsumed by command and control. Final piece of advice for you, the last thing I will say is this: never forget, nothing good ever came out of running in heels.